Now to Russia, and Alexi Navalny's funeral is set to take place in Moscow today under tight security. The vocal Putin critic died in detention 2 weeks ago in an Arctic prison where he was being held on what supporters have called politically motivated charges. Mourners are gathering at the church where Navalny's funeral service is expected to be held. The crowd has been placed behind fences that security forces set up throughout the morning. Opposition activists believe that Russian authorities tried to block a public ceremony to avoid potential street protests. Well, let's go straight over to our correspondent, Yuri Risheto. He joins us from Riga, from where he's been reporting since Russian authorities closed down DW's Moscow bureau. Yuri, there's been a lot of confusion surrounding the preparations for Navalny's funeral. What can you tell us about it at this point?
Well, Navalny is expected to be first laid out in the church. He was a religious man who was committed to the Russian Orthodox Church. The funeral service is to take place at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Moscow time, in a church in the Mariino district of Moscow, where Alexei Navalny, by the way, lived with his family. He will then be buried at the Borisovskoye cemetery close to this church. According to media reports, this cemetery has been specially secured by the police since yesterday. The police have also been monitoring the cemetery reportedly since yesterday, and some interference devices have also reportedly been installed to disrupt the mobile connection. I remember this from my time in Moscow when the authorities also disrupted the mobile connection during the protests. So there are very high security measures at the cemetery and at the church. As for other cities in Russia, Alexei Navalny's team has called on Russians across the country to lay flowers in front of the monuments to politically persecuted people today as a sign of last honor for the dead opposition politician.
Now, Navalny's widow, Yulia Navalnaya, said she didn't know whether the funeral would be peaceful. What does she mean by that, Yuri? What might happen?
Well, look, 2 weeks before the election, the presidential election, the Kremlin needs anything but protests in Russia, or loud protests. And Navalny was the politician who was best able to bring the masses onto the streets. So those protests were often not peaceful because the police arrested thousands of people. That is why the details of the funeral are kept more or less secret to avoid these protests. We remember, by the way, when Navalny returned to Moscow 3 years ago after his treatment in Germany following poisoning in Russia, his plane was turned around shortly before landing so that as few people, as few journalists as possible could welcome him and could cover his return. This time, the Navalny people haven't called for protest, as far as I know. Instead, they've said that Russians should express their protest by voting against Putin in the presidential elections on March 17th. But no one can guarantee, Terry, that there might be unrest today as well.
You mentioned the upcoming election, Yuri. Everything points to yet another term for Vladimir Putin as president. What does this say about the cause that Navalny fought and died for, Yuri?
Well, there has been no political opposition in Russia for years. What is called the opposition in the Duma is actually loyal to the Kremlin and the government. This is clearly reflected in the fact that none of the Duma parties are speaking out against the war. The only presidential candidate to speak out against it was not allowed to stand for election. In this respect, Navalny's death didn't change anything, but despite this, Putin's critics, who live mainly abroad, will not give up, they say. We saw Yulia Navalnaya, for example, the wife, the widow of Navalny, in the EU Parliament on Wednesday, presenting herself as her husband's successor. It won't be easy for her because President Putin is still very popular in Russia, and when it comes to the elections, there is a problem with voter participation. Most Russians will certainly not go to the polls this time as many times ago, because most Russians have absolutely no interest in politics. They live by the motto, the state should leave me alone, I'll manage on my own somehow.
Yuri, thank you very much for your insights. DW's Yuri Risheto there in Riga.